Today, we're looking at the war that truly changed everything. A conflict so unbelievably massive that the people who lived through it actually called it the war to end all wars. So let's get right into it.
Okay, so just picture this. A single gunshot on a street corner in a city called Sarajevo. How on earth does that, one single moment, how does that one gunshot ignite a fire that burns across the entire planet, claiming 40 million lives and literally redrawing the map? Well, the short answer is, it didn't. Not really. That gunshot wasn't the fire. It was just the match thrown onto a continent that was basically a giant can of gasoline, just waiting for a spark.
Right, so let's talk about that powder keg. What made Europe so ready to explode in 1914? Because, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that was just the trigger. The real reasons, the deep-down causes, well, they had been building up for years and years.
It really comes down to a perfect storm of four big things. First, you've got this crazy tangle of alliances. Think of it like two big gangs. The Triple Entente, that's France, Britain, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Then, everyone's in a massive arms race. Military spending just shot through the roof. On top of that, all these big empires are fighting over colonies around the world. And the fourth piece? This incredibly intense nationalism, especially down in the Balkans, which was just a tinderbox waiting to catch fire.
And this is where those alliances become a huge problem. Just look how fast everything happens. It's like a chain reaction. The Archduke is assassinated. Austria-Hungary gives Serbia this impossible ultimatum and then declares war. Russia, who sees itself as Serbia's big brother, starts mobilizing its army. So then Germany, Austria-Hungary's ally, declares war on Russia. And because France is Russia's ally, Germany decides to invade neutral Belgium to get a clear shot at France, and that is the final straw that pulls Great Britain into the fight. Bam, bam, bam. In just over a month, the whole continent is at war. The dominoes just fell, one after another.
So once the dust settles, you've basically got two teams. The Allied powers, which started as the Entente, eventually grow to include Italy, who actually switched sides, and, crucially, the United States later on. And they're up against the Central Powers, which is mainly Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they're soon joined by the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria.
The crazy thing is, almost everyone thought this war would be over by Christmas. The boys will be home by Christmas. That was the slogan. Boy, were they wrong. So wrong. This war started with guys on horseback, like something out of the 19th century, but it quickly turned into this brutal industrial meat grinder, something the world had never, ever seen before.
Germany had this big plan, the Schlieffen Plan. The idea was simple: smash France really fast, then turn and deal with Russia. But it completely failed at the Battle of the Marne. And listen to this quote from the German Crown Prince just a few weeks into the war. He's already saying, "We have lost the war." It's incredible. He knew right then that their shot at a quick win was gone, and a long, grinding war on two fronts was a nightmare they couldn't win.
So the quick war plan's in ruins. What happens? Both sides literally dig into the ground, and what you get is the single most iconic and horrifying image of World War I on the Western Front. This giant, unbroken scar of trenches, mud, and barbed wire stretching almost 500 miles all the way from the English Channel to the Swiss border.
And this stalemate led to this absolutely insane, feudal cycle of violence. It was the same thing, over and over. First, a massive artillery barrage that would go on for days, just to soften up the other side. Then the whistles would blow, and thousands of men would go over the top, charging across the wasteland of no man's land. But they were running straight into machine guns and barbed wire. It was a meat grinder, just unimaginable casualties for a few yards of muddy ground if they were lucky. See, the whole problem was that the technology of defense was just light years ahead of the tactics for attack. The machine gun, heavy artillery, these things made it basically suicide to try and cross open ground. And then they introduced new horrors, like poison gas. Later in the war, you start seeing tanks and airplanes, but those were really just desperate attempts to figure out some way to break this bloody deadlock. And the human cost of this, it's just staggering. Look at the big battles of 1916, like Verdun and the Somme. These weren't about brilliant tactics. It was pure attrition. The strategy was literally just to kill more of their guys than they killed of yours. The numbers, they don't even feel real. We're talking about almost 1 million casualties at Verdun, over 1 million at the Somme. The British Army alone lost almost 60,000 men on the first day of the Somme. It's just mind-boggling.
So this meat grinder goes on for 4 long years. But then, starting around 1917, things begin to shift. The pieces on the chessboard start moving in a way that will finally break the stalemate and lead to the end of the war.
So what were the big game changers? Really, it's 2 massive things. First, the United States finally enters the war. That means fresh troops and America's incredible industrial power are now on the Allied side. At the same time, Russia collapses into revolution and drops out of the war. This is huge for Germany. It frees up their troops from the Eastern Front. They throw everything they have into one last, desperate gamble, the Spring Offensive. But when that fails, the German army, already exhausted, finally begins to break.
And you can see that shift right here on this chart. It's so clear. Look at the Allied strength just shooting up as all these fresh American troops pour in. And at the same time, look at the German strength just plummeting. They'd been bled dry for 4 years, their last big push failed, and their army was just collapsing. The scales had finally and decisively tipped.
Germany was falling apart. There was revolution brewing back home. Their allies were surrendering one by one. They had no choice left. And so, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the fighting stopped. The guns on the Western Front fell silent. After 4 long, brutal years, the Great War was over.
But just because the fighting stopped doesn't mean the story ends there. Not at all. The war cast this long, dark shadow over the entire globe. And the peace that followed, well, in a lot of ways, it was just a continuation of the war, by other means.
Let's just try to absorb the human cost. It's almost impossible. We're talking about 9 to 11 million soldiers killed. A whole generation of young men, just gone. They call it the lost generation for a reason. You had villages, especially in France and Britain, where there were basically no men left between the ages of, say, 18 and 30.
And this wasn't just a soldiers' war. The horror spread far beyond the trenches. Millions of civilians, anywhere from 6 to 13 million, died from starvation, from disease, from atrocities. And then, as if that wasn't enough, the Spanish flu pandemic swept the globe, carried everywhere by the very soldiers moving around for the war.
So when you add it all up, killed and wounded, you get to around 40 million people. It's a number so big it's hard to even picture. It was a demographic disaster, a catastrophe that would scar the entire 20th century.
And you know, the war didn't just kill people. It killed empires. 4 of them. These massive, ancient powers just vanished. The Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. All of them, after centuries of rule, just crumbled into dust.
Then came the peace treaty, the famous Treaty of Versailles. And look, it was supposed to stop another war from ever happening again, but it was just deeply, deeply flawed. Especially this war guilt clause, which forced Germany to take all the blame plus pay these crippling reparations. All it really did was create this massive sense of bitterness and humiliation in Germany. And that resentment, well, it would be exploited in the worst possible way just a couple of decades later.
So this is the world that's left. The map of Europe is totally different. You've got new countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia popping up from the ashes of the old empires. And they create this new thing, the League of Nations, with this grand, noble idea of keeping the peace forever. Spoilers, it didn't work out.
So, the war to end all wars. It did anything but. In fact, all of its leftover problems led directly to an even bigger, even more destructive war just 20 years later. This conflict literally created the world we live in now, from the borders in the Middle East to the political ideas that still dominate today. Which leaves us with a pretty heavy question, doesn't it? 100 years on, when we see the same echoes of extreme nationalism, tangled alliances, and global uncertainty, what lessons from that long, dark shadow have we still not learned?